Okay, so let's talk about GDP and inflation. Of course, GDP stands for gross domestic product. Inflation is basically when the value of your dollar decreases over time. But we're going to talk about what GDP is, how it's calculated, how you find out what inflation is, and who it affects the most in this video today. GDP is the measuring tool to analyze the big economic picture. Basically, how is the economy doing on a global scale, on a market scale, or on a country scale? It's the market value of all final goods produced within a period of time in an economy. It's important. The higher the GDP, typically the higher the education and literacy rates in that country. It also helps define our standard of living. The higher the GDP, there are certain things that become to be standard or expected as standard. In some cases, that could be something as simple as centralized air conditioning, public transportation, things of that nature. So the higher the GDP, it kind of increases certain expectations. What does not count in GDP? Well, first, let's talk about intermediate goods. These are resource goods. Any good that you use to create another good is considered a resource good. It does not count. Financial resources, this is investments because this is essentially the shifting of finances from one to another. Public transfer payments, stimulus funds, again, doesn't count. Private transfer payments, this is person-to-person payments. Those don't count either. Used goods, secondhand sales. So used cars do not count in our GDP. Household work, community service, volunteer work doesn't count. And of course, the underground economy doesn't work. Black market. You have no idea how to measure it. Plus, it's activities that we're not necessarily supposed to be encouraging. Anyway, nominal GDP is measured in current capital. I like to describe nominal as normal. And why do I use nominal for normal? If you have $5, and again, this is just a very simplistic explanation, but I just kind of want you to get the understanding of the vocabulary. If you have $5 in your pocket, according to the nominal GDP, you have $5 in your pocket. In your mind, you could purchase $5 worth of things because that's your nominal GDP. Real GDP accounts for the value including inflation. All right. So again, using another simplistic way of explaining it, it's like having that same $5 in your pocket and going to the dollar store and trying to purchase 5 things. Well, now you have to include tax. We're going to substitute tax for inflation. Well, now you can't get 5 things because you don't have enough. So your real purchasing power includes inflation. All right. Your per capita GDP is your capital per person on average. So basically, you take the total GDP and you create an average of what each person's per person GDP is. The actual formula to measure GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. What does all of that mean? Well, C is the consumption of household spending. Believe it or not, household spending accounts for 2/3 of GDP spending. I is investment. This is spending by businesses for investments in machinery, buildings, construction work, so on and so forth. G, government. All levels of government spending on schools, military, the list goes on. And then X minus M is your net exports. What we export minus what we import. So whenever you buy something from China that is being created and shipped here from China, goes against our GDP, but whatever China buys from us goes for our GDP. GDP increases economic growth and unemployment tends to decrease. GDP decreases, the economy constricts and unemployment begins to increase. If you have 2 consecutive years of restriction, it's considered a recession. There is some debate that it not being 2 consecutive years of restriction, this could be 2 consecutive periods. All right, so that could be something that we look at a little bit later. Inflation hurts people on fixed income, retired individuals, people who save, and lenders. If you loan money out, and you don't have enough interest to cover the cost of inflation, you are going to lose the original amount that you loaned out. Inflation helps people who borrow money, homeowners, and people that get COLA or cost of living adjustments. Inflation, an increase in the average price of goods and services. 3.4% is considered a normal rate of inflation. Hyperinflation is overdrive. It's when things go out of control. 10%, 12%. I believe in other countries have experienced inflation as high as 1,000%. Deflation is when prices go down. And then there's stagflation. That's when inflation increases and unemployment increases at the same time. Now, what causes inflation? There are a couple different theories. One is quantity theory. Too much money in circulation. Because I know the question is always asked, why don't we just print more money? Well, the more you have of something, the less it's worth. Let me say that again. The more you have of one thing, the less it's worth, because you can easily replace it. The one of a kind tends to cost more. So that's the quantity theory. Quantity theory is too much money in circulation causes the value of the dollar to decrease. Then you have what's called the demand pull theory. This is when there's a shortage. When there's a shortage, it pulls the prices up. Now, conceptually, I want you to think about release date with Jordans. When those come out, you can buy the shoe at store price. But if you miss the release date from buying it in the store because there is a shortage, someone is going to post them on eBay or Amazon or wherever the case may be, but they're going to kick the price up. They're going to raise the price on that same product. That also causes inflation. And then cost push theory. There's always going to be inflation if you increase the cost of resources. A lot of people tend to overlook this one when we talk about raising minimum wage. You've just pushed or increased the cost of resources, because minimum wage is a resource cost. That employer has to make up that loss of revenue, and he's going to do it by way of increasing the cost, which then in turn lowers the value of the dollar in your pocket. So how do we measure inflation? We use what's called a CPI, or Consumer Price Index. All right, there's this imaginary basket, and you see this little basket that's being represented here. And you just take randomly 400 goods and services are calculated in the market basket. 42% comes from housing goods, 18% from transportation, 15% from food and beverage, 6% from medical care, 6% from recreation, 6% for education, communication, 4% for apparel, so on and so forth. And they put them in a basket and they tally up those costs. And then they come back a year later and they basically do the same thing. It won't have to be the exact same items. It just has to be something similar to account for it. And then the difference is your price index. All right. There should be some increase in price of the current year, of the year, the current year versus the original year, the base year. And once you calculate the difference, you're able to calculate the percent of inflation. Unemployment. Unemployment and inflation go hand in hand. First of all, who's unemployed? People that do not have a job but are actively looking for work, they're unemployed. Notice that keyword, actively. Underemployed. This is someone that currently has a job, but they want more hours, they want more pay. That discouraged worker is the person that has given up on looking for more work. You have frictional unemployment. This is when a person takes time to find a job. So when you're out of college, you've got your degree or you've got a certification, now you're looking for a job in your field or with that certification. That's called frictional unemployment. Seasonal unemployment is employment based on seasonal work. All right, so think of those Halloween stores that come up every year. Well, Halloween stores open up and they sell costumes, but is there a need for the Halloween stores in March? No. Structural unemployment. These are jobs and they're people want the jobs, but their skills don't match. So let's say, for example, you are looking for a job and you keep finding jobs for welding, but you don't have the skill for welding. That is structural unemployment. Then you have cyclical unemployment. This is employment that rises and falls based on the economy. So it follows the trends of the economy. And then you have the natural rate of unemployment. It's a simple equation. Frictional unemployment plus structural unemployment gives you your natural rate of unemployment. So you'll never have a 0% of unemployment. You'll never have 0% of unemployment. There's always going to be someone whose skills don't match the jobs that are available. And there's always going to be someone who's looking for a different job because they've improved their standing. So that's going to be your natural rate of unemployment. Now, we always hear this conversation of this concept of labor force. Who exactly is in the labor force? The labor force is limited to two categories: the unemployed and the employed. That's your entire labor force. But look over here. These are all people that don't count in the labor force. If you're under the age of 16, you don't count. If you're institutionalized, like you've been in the hospital due to mental incapacity or even prison, you don't count. You've retired, you don't count. Military doesn't count. Full-time students doesn't count. But let me look at one other thing here, because you might say, well, I'm 17, so I count. But you're also a full-time student. You don't count. Stay-at-home parents and discouraged workers. All of these individuals do not count in the labor force. Okay? Why does that matter? Well, the labor force helps us determine where we can improve as far as jobs goes. It helps us determine how we can fight unemployment numbers. When we look at the business cycle, the hiring and the firing, and the economy and how they kind of go hand in hand, we're going to start looking at systematic changes in the GDP and the economy and how it affects the business cycle. You have the expansion phase. This is when the GDP is doing good, it's increasing, unemployment is going down, inflation is increasing at a normal rate, and you have total demand, meaning people that are willing to buy things. It's actually increasing on a whole scale. Once it hits its peak, we are at the top of the economy. The GDP is at the highest point, unemployment's at the lowest point, and inflation is at the highest point because more people are buying and spending money. Okay? So these two are good. Contraction is when things start to change a little bit. Contraction phase, you have GDP that begins to decrease, unemployment begins to go up, inflation begins to decrease, you have aggregate demand decrease, meaning total demand, people are not spending money. Recession is a 6-month contraction. Let me say that again. Recession is a 6-month contraction. So anything longer or considered a prolonged recession leads to a depression. And then the very final phase of the business cycle is what we call the trough. This phase, the GDP is at the lowest, unemployment is at its highest, inflation is at the lowest, and total demand continuously decreases. So if we look at this is just your standard wavelength. You've got your peak, which is here. You've got your contraction. You've got your trough. And then you've got your expansion. Business cycle on a wavelength. The business cycle on a wavelength. Okay? Hopefully that should begin to explain things for you.